One of the things that we've noticed from our online numbers is that whenever we do a story on the media in Sri Lanka, we get a lot of hits, principally from Sri Lankans. There's an appetite for information on the island because over the past few years, freedom of the press has been under attack by the government there. One newspaper in particular has been in the governmental crosshairs, the Sunday Leader. Back in 2009, its editor was threatened with death over his journalism, then shot and killed. And his successor, having been threatened herself, has recently fled the country. We'll be speaking with Frederica Jansz in a minute, but first, a bit more background on the state of play in the Sri Lankan media. When the Sunday Leader's editor, Lasantha Wickrematunge, was shot and killed on the streets of Colombo in 2009, he saw it coming. We know that because before his death, he wrote an editorial on his own death, published posthumously in his newspaper, in which he blamed his killing on the government of President Mahinda Rajapaksa. In that article, he predicted no one would ever be charged with his murder, and no one was. Wickrematunge's successor, Frederica Jansz, had her own run-ins with the government, including an extraordinary clash with the president's brother, Sri Lanka's defense minister. Jansz says the minister threatened her over the phone and said there were a lot of people in Sri Lanka who wanted to see her killed. She then published a transcript of the call. A few months later, the Sunday Leader had brand new owners with close ties to the government, and Frederica Jansz says she was fired. She has since fled the country and has made an asylum claim. Jansz says she does not want her location revealed for security reasons. She spoke to the Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi.
Frederica Jansz, welcome to the Listening Post. We understand you don't want people to know where you are, but can you tell us what made you leave Sri Lanka? You know, you'd been receiving threats throughout your 4 years as editor of the Sunday Leader, but what changed in September? What made you leave?
I finally made the decision to leave after I was told by my lawyers that my passport was to be impounded and that there was a very real possibility that I was looking at a jail term very soon. Even after my services were terminated as editor-in-chief of the Sunday Leader, I was followed home twice by men on motorbikes. I received a threatening phone call where the caller spoke in the vernacular in Sinhalese and threatened me with death, saying that if I continued to take on the Defense Secretary, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, that I would be killed, that he was considered a hero in Sri Lanka because he had successfully ended the war. And, you know, in the backdrop of all that had happened to me, particularly involving a story and a transcript of a conversation that I had published involving the Defense Secretary, I was told, and I actually began to finally believe it, that my life was very seriously under threat. So yes, so I made up my mind. I have young children, that my sons need a mum and not a heroine.
Speaking about your relationship with the defense minister, that phone transcript, that conversation that you published in the Sunday Leader, you were basically calling him to follow up on a story that you were investigating. And in the course of that conversation, he threatened you. Is that typical? Is that how the defense minister, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, is that how he talks with all journalists? Is that the kind of interaction he has?
This has been one of the worst cases where he abused me in, yes, absolutely foul language and said that if he and I were at a public function together, that 90% of the people there would want to see me dead, would want to kill me, he actually said. Now, having said that, this kind of behavior by the Defense Secretary is not unique to me only. He has previously threatened journalists in Sri Lanka, including foreign journalists.
You know, in September last year, just after you had published that transcript of that conversation, an investor named Asanga Seneviratne, he bought a majority stake in the Sunday Leader. And then the paper was made to publish an apology to the defense minister, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, for making that conversation public. This is despite the fact that you had evidence, you had the tapes to show that the conversation occurred.
Asanga Seneviratne was pushed, I would say that the sale was accelerated following my having published a transcript of that conversation, and he was given orders that I clearly had to go, that the lady had to go. So no sooner Asanga took over 2 days later, he fabricated, or he got a presidential confidant to fabricate charges against me. A police entry was made, and I stood my ground. I refused to resign, and I actually told Mr. Seneviratne that he could sack me if he wished to do so, which he did do.
The Sunday leader had a reputation for taking on the president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, for taking on his government. Talk to us about the sorts of issues you were covering. What stories were you reporting that other news outlets in Sri Lanka weren't doing?
Well, for example, post-war, one story that comes to mind immediately is a story I carried on the front page in 2011, where I said that a foreign government, namely China, had given a grant to the president as much as $9 million US. It is the first time ever, I think, in the whole history of Sri Lanka that a foreign government has given a head of state such huge sums of money to be used at their discretion. And we ran this story. We had proof. The president went absolutely berserk. He called the chairman of the Sunday leader, Lal Vikramatunga. He screamed at him and threatened him too. 2 days later, posters were printed, calling the Sunday leader and its journalists traitors, and these posters came up all over outside the office. So yes, so that is one instance. But as a result, we paid a price. We always have.
The civil war in Sri Lanka lasted 25 years. And especially during the last couple of years, that final push towards the end, journalists, the media came under a lot of pressure. For example, journalists were not allowed to go into the war zone. They were monitored. Many of them were kicked out. Was that a turning point for Sri Lankan media? Or, would you describe this as a more slow and steady slide in the government's tolerance towards reporting that it does not like?
It was definitely a slow and steady slide. Since the end of the war in May 2009, there has been a very definite takeover or state control of all media outlets, and that includes independently or privately owned media. The Sunday leader actually is a classic example of what happened. Similarly, the government continued its attack on journalists post-war. One case that comes to mind is the news editor of the Jaffna-based Udayan Tamil newspaper, where its news editor, Mr. Kuhanathan, was brutally attacked in 2011. Men with iron rods attacked him and he almost died. In 2010, another journalist, Prageet Eknaligoda, went missing. He is yet to be found. So the level of intimidation, the harassment has continued. They have continued to call journalists traitors. Lawyers appearing for me and the Sunday leader were termed or called terrorists and traitors. I mean, you have the chairman of the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation who goes on air every morning. He has a show that he speaks on. He has character assassinated me, for example, day after day on that show.
The split between the Sinhalese and the Tamils in Sri Lanka has defined the country for so many decades now. Is that divide reflected in the media landscape? For example, in the post-war Sri Lanka, how have Tamil media outlets, how have Tamil journalists fared?
They have fared very badly. There is the well-publicized case of J.S. Tissanayagam, Tissa as he was affectionately known. Tissa was arrested by members of the Terrorism Investigation Division, the TID in Sri Lanka in 2008. He was sentenced to 20 years rigorous imprisonment in 2009 for having just published 2 editorials in a quarterly magazine that he published, which focused on issues in the North and East and human rights issues. Tissa was subsequently granted a presidential pardon 2 years into serving his sentence, only because of intense international pressure that was brought on the government. But Tissa has left the country and lives in exile, as do 30 or more other journalists who have left Sri Lanka since the conclusion of the war.
10 years ago, if I had told you that 2 editors from the same paper would become victims of Sri Lanka's media crackdown, your predecessor, Lasantha Vikramatunga, he was shot down, now you are in exile, would you have believed that it was possible?
No. Where Lasantha was concerned, there was always a very real danger that he could be killed, that he could be murdered. As far as I was concerned, because I was on the newspaper and serving as one of its main investigative reporters, I also was victim to many death threats, both written and verbal over the telephone. I was also hauled up before the courts in politically motivated cases. But having said that, it never ever, I never dreamt that I would one day actually have to flee Sri Lanka and live in exile. That is something that I never envisaged. And if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have just said never. I would never leave.
Frederica Jansz, thank you very much for speaking with the Listening Post.